there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by 3 self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL Cultures. So this episode's TEFL Culture is a very obvious one, and it's I can't believe we haven't talked about it before, but perhaps that's the reason we haven't talked about it. It's so obvious. It's PPP.
Okay, we have not talked about it.
We've not talked about PPP. I don't think.
Okay.
Not specifically as a culture.
We talked about TPR.
TPR. Well, that's a different acronym.
It's got a P in it.
It's got a P in it, yeah. And the reason that I want to talk about this is because there was an article published recently in ELTJ looking at the history of PPP, and there were some things in the article that for me were quite surprising, quite interesting, so I thought maybe we could talk about it.
Okay.
So instead of the usual TEFL culture where we present kind of some of the theoretical background and talk about it and that, I'm going to structure this a little differently. I'm going to ask you guys some questions to get your perceptions of aspects of PPP, and then I'll explain what this article has to say about those, and we can go from there. Okay. First of all, what is PPP?
I mean, it's a common way of planning a lesson.
Okay.
It's a common way of practicing, producing, presenting language.
Not in that order.
Not in that order. But they are the common kind of...
What is the correct order?
Present. It's slightly, it's a bit odd because present is the teacher presenting the language.
Yeah.
But then the next 2 P's, I guess, are more student-centered.
Practice, produce.
Practice, produce.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I guess maybe the important thing is the difference between practice and produce.
Right. What is that difference, would you say?
I guess practice could be maybe a controlled practice. So the students, I mean, I guess there's a million different ways of doing it.
Produce could be the task itself.
Could be a task.
Practice could be form-focused. Actually focusing on the language needed. I don't know, I often get confused between like the task-based language learning cycle and PPP, because I think the two are very similar, but
I think they can be.
Yeah.
A lot of people
But
think they're
depends.
not, but...
Well, it depends on the type of task-based lesson you're doing.
Right.
Some task-based, I guess there's no presentation of any language.
Even within the production part, that can be like further broken down into like feedback, post-task, pre-task.
Right.
You know, so
Yeah, you could map it onto it in different ways.
Yeah, I think you could, yeah.
Yeah, but so I mean, there's a few different ways of thinking about it, and as you say, you can kind of tie it into different approaches. But basically, it's presentation, practice, produce. The teacher presents some new language. The learners do a kind of controlled practice, and then they do a freer production stage where they try and use the language.
Yeah.
So, what do you think is the theoretical foundation of PPP in terms of theories of language and of language learning?
In terms of theories of language, I guess the idea that you first passively, you get passive exposure to the target language and maybe some kind of explicit explanation of it, overt explanation of it.
Okay. Do you have any ideas?
That the explicit becomes implicit knowledge, perhaps.
Okay. Perhaps. Yeah. Well, I think
you get told something explicitly, and then you try and take that on as your own, and make it your own through production.
Yeah. So that's it's basically skill acquisition theory. What this article, which I'll give the title, it's called A Potted History of PPP with the Help of ELT Journal. It's by Jason Anderson, and as I say, it was published in ELT Journal recently. So in that, he refutes the idea that PPP originates in audiolingual or behaviourist traditions. Is that something you would have associated with?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily.
Right.
Certainly the presentation part is quite it could be quite behaviourist.
Right. Maybe that's
language
where.
I'm going to
Right.
tell you we need for this and practice it.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily connect the production part to audiolingualism.
Right. What do you think that ties to in terms of language learning movements?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about the origins of PPP necessarily, but obviously the production stage can be, and nowadays is most commonly, I guess, connected to a more communicative approach.
Okay.
Yeah, CLT, isn't it, pretty much?
Right,
In a
okay.
nutshell, that's what it is.
Exactly, perfect. So this is this is what.
Is that all we needed to say?
The article's saying. Well, what the article's saying is that although people say that PPP originates in audiolingual or behaviourist approaches,
Right.
It actually was first introduced as part of the communicative revolution.
I think the feeling I got in the last 10 years or so is that I think because PPP is what's taught in CELTAs, and because it's a very kind of, I guess, as people get more experience teaching, they want to start leaving PPP behind because they think of it as too simplistic, and maybe that kind of leaving behind because of that they tie it into audiolingualism as another kind of left behind methodology.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. Perhaps so. Well, I think it's certainly true that it's still included on certificate courses, and we will come back to that a little bit later on.
Yeah.
When do you think that PPP enjoyed the most popularity as a method?
I'd say probably during the 70s.
Okay.
Perhaps. Maybe a little bit later, during the kind of the onset of like the CLT,
Right.
and that kind of thing.
It was around the early 1980s.
Yeah, perhaps.
Or the late 70s, early 80s.
That sounds about right. Although I'm sure if we went back and listened to our some of our old pioneers, it's probably been used for centuries.
Right.
Yeah.
But I guess kind of after being codified as an approach.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So one part of this article that I found really interesting was where the author surveys old articles from the ELT journal and classifies them as against PPP, neutral, or for PPP from about 1980 to 2015. Okay, and as you can see in this diagram, listeners at home enjoy us looking at a diagram. It starts out with positive and neutral comments. So between 1981 and 1985, positive and neutral articles. 1986 to 1990, lots of positive articles. So this is kind of the later stages of the communicative revolution, I guess.
Yeah.
A few neutral and a few negative.
Right.
In 1991 to 1995, the negative starts to outweigh the others. In 1996 to 2000, negative is very high, positive is very low, and neutral, so where people are just mentioning PPP, starts to become a very big section of it. The same kind of trend continues 2001 to 2005. In 2006 to 2010, the number of articles against PPP is reduced. And by the time you get to 2011 to 2015, there are no articles against PPP, lots of neutrals, and there's a very gradual increase in articles that are in favour of PPP.
Yeah.
So it's kind of come full circle in a way. Well,
Kind of,
yeah.
there's been more of an interest and then quite a lot of negativity, and then it's kind of come back again. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Especially how the negative articles or the negative mentions of PPP kind of reduced quite dramatically, actually.
Yes.
From the late 90s to now. From the late 90s at quite a peak to now when there are none.
Yes. Well, also 2001 to 2005. There's
also quite a lot.
Yeah. So I think what Anderson says in the article is that there was kind of a rejection of PPP in the 1990s. Why do you think that was?
Maybe more of an interest in alternative methodologies.
I think task-based learning.
Task-based learning, maybe.
Doing more lexical approaches.
Yeah, maybe that was the kind of height of kind of a stronger version of task-based learning.
Yeah, like Dogme
Right.
in the graph there where you show the highest amount of This one here.
That would be around dogme.
That's around when the dogme question arose.
Yeah.
Which kind of rejects this whole the teacher being the language.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes
Because you need some target language for PPP.
Right.
You need some kind of some language to present.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Well, there are a few reasons that Anderson gives, and you've touched on some of them already. The first one is that there is an incorrect assumption in PPP, or at least at that time, people thought there was an incorrect assumption about how languages or features of languages can be isolated and taught.
Right.
So this was at the time when people were kind of focusing more on,
skills or...
Yeah, and but also things like interlanguage development and natural orders of language.
Right.
And so the idea that PPP, you could just choose the grammar structure and teach it, and then students would learn it, was rejected.
Yeah.
Which I think it still is rejected to quite a large extent.
Sure.
The second reason people criticised it was because they said that language is a system that's better understood holistically, which is where you get things like task-based learning.
Yeah.
Thirdly, perhaps connected to task-based learning and dogme, it's teacher-centred PPP. So people at this time were saying that too much one-way transmission, and it didn't cater to the needs of individual learners. And finally, that it's prescriptive and inflexible. Describing only one of many types of lesson.
Yeah.
Do you think those are fair criticisms?
And I think a PPP lesson can be very student-centered in other ways, in terms of how much the student is producing language, how much of the focus is on what the student is doing versus what the teacher is doing.
Right.
So some of those criticisms come back to misconceptions about PPP, or about different ways that PPP can be applied.
Right.
I don't see any problems with PPP. But also I'd add, there's before the first P, there is stuff that goes on before that first P. So like needs analysis. If you do a needs analysis followed by some sort of presentation, then that's okay. Yeah. Or if in a dogme approach, if you reveal some language that's emergent, then present it back to the students or repackage it as a lesson. Right. What's the problem with that?
And the language presentation can be learner-centered and implicit. Doesn't have to, a dictogloss could be used for the first P.
Well, it's interesting that you're talking about things like emergent language from the learners. So one reason that Anderson says in this article that PPP is very durable in the profession is because it's compatible with course books. So, course books often have grammar points that you introduce and then you practice and produce, and it's easy to just use it to teach through a course book, basically, from start to finish. And so maybe for that reason, it's continued to be kind of quite popular, and that doesn't fit in so much with learner-generated language and needs analysis necessarily, which perhaps is another reason why it was rejected for a long time.
I mean, most modern course books are basically that each unit follows a PPP pattern.
Right.
But I think if any lesson where you have any kind of target language, it's hard to think of a more efficient kind of step-by-step way of planning it other than PPP.
Right, yeah. I think he quotes Henry Widdowson, previous interviewee, as saying that even if you've got new and exciting ways of teaching language or new and exciting ways of learning language, that approach has to be teachable, and a lot of them aren't very teachable, and PPP is very teachable as an approach. Another reason that PPP has been making kind of a comeback, according to Anderson, is that SLA research has started to show it to be effective.
Okay.
And he references two meta-analyses, one by Spada and Tomita, and one by Norris and Ortega. Both the Norris and Ortega one in the year 2000, Spada and Tomita 2010, which show the effectiveness, according to Anderson, of PPP. And he quotes Spada and Tomita by saying, "If PPP is nonsense, then skill acquisition theory is nonsense, at least as applied to language learning. If teacher-imposed explicit grammar instruction is useless, then how can it lead to large improvements in performance measured by spontaneous output measures? If explicit knowledge does not help performance, then why are there positive correlations between L2 metalinguistic knowledge and oral measures of L2 proficiency?" Yeah. So, again, according to this article, and there's probably SLA people out there who can give more information on this, but according to this article, SLA research is starting to show that there is some effectiveness at least to PPP. So I think PPP, interesting. I think this article, if you're interested in reading it, as I said, it's called A Potted History of PPP with the Help of ELT Journal by Jason Anderson. He also has another article from this year in ELT, English Language Teacher Education and Development, which is open access, free to access, which covers the same ground, I think. So yeah, go and check that out. But that's today's TEFL Culture, PPP.
TEFL News.
For this episode's TEFL News, I thought we'd take one of our kind of biannual looks at some of the ways that technology is being used for language learning. So basically, I just want to kind of run through kind of 4 more recent bits of software, basically computer-assisted language learning tools that are available. 4 that are popular at the moment or have been in the news for some reason. So the first one I want to talk about it's by a company called MonkeyMoon. I'm not sure exactly how I pronounce it.
Yeah.
MONKIMUN.
Maybe we should just say at the beginning, we're not being sponsored by any of these, are we?
No, we're not.
Okay.
We're not.
So just
It's their slogan, everybody's hooking up the big monkey mun.
It is actually.
because just in case some people think we are.
Yeah, no, we're definitely not. This is it's basically a series of apps for kids. But they've hooked up with Oxford University Press, and they're very proud of the fact that they get content from Oxford University Press. So basically, it's what you can imagine apps for kids, little games and stuff. And their big claim is that students will, or the kids who use it will just be exposed to lots and lots of different structures and vocabulary.
Which, as we all know, is how kids learn.
Well, there's a couple of quotes from their website. One is that they're experts in language learning, so we can trust them. The next is that their apps...
Not TEFLologists, though.
They're not TEFLologists, though. The next is that their apps stimulate language learning pathways, which sounds like one of those things that basically means nothing, but is meant to sound good to people who don't know anything about language learning.
Right. Yeah.
They also say things like, our hits and errors algorithm adapts each lesson to your child's learning speed.
How does it do that?
Well, it's an algorithm, Rob, so you just have to trust it.
Don't question it.
Yeah. I think it seems like very similar things like, have either you tried Duolingo?
Yes, we talked about it on the podcast.
Yeah.
Episode 6.
It sounds like it's a very similar thing, but more child-friendly.
Right.
And just with games and stuff.
Okay.
So maybe we can discuss that along with the next one that I want to talk about, which is called Lingualia.
That sounds like a word someone just made up, unlike our podcast title.
Exactly. Or MonkeyMoon. This is very similar to Duolingo, actually. The main differences I found is that there are challenges, which you can basically challenge like friends who are studying the same language as you. Little language challenges, little language games.
Okay.
And it has a little character, Lingu the robot, who again is run by an algorithm that'll adapt to your learning speed.
Okay.
But one of the main extra features it has is that you can connect. So if you're learning, for example, Spanish, they'll connect you with somebody else learning, a Spanish person learning English, and you do a little language exchange. Which to me seems like that would be the best part of the whole thing. But like, why not just do that?
Right.
But I guess, you need a bit more. So first of all, like, what do you think about these kind of Duolingo type apps where basically a lot of them are, little games, matching vocabulary games, sentence completion, that kind of thing.
I've done that kind of thing when I was preparing for the Japanese language proficiency test. I used quite a lot of those apps, and I thought that they were all right, but I knew the answer, or I didn't know the answer, and it didn't help me learn. Like it just said, that's wrong.
Right.
Why? I don't know. It's actually what Denise Murray was saying in our last episode, I think, that quite often they'll tell you that you've got it wrong, but then they can't, because it's just an app, it can't explain to you why you got it wrong, and that doesn't help you actually learn it or get it right. Yeah. So I don't like that kind of thing, but I'm quite interested by the idea of exchanging, like having kind of language exchange. That seems very interesting.
Yeah, I think the first one in particular it can only really test your knowledge. It can't teach you a language.
I mean, I guess it's in the same way that having a vocabulary list might you might learn some vocabulary. You just you test yourself over and over again, and then you check whether or not you got it right.
I mean, these things are purely supplementary. They shouldn't they shouldn't replace the teacher.
Yeah.
And like you talked about this before, the idea of like speed learning materials. A lot of people tend to think that if I get that, I'll simply just learn the language through this application, and that's not the case. But I think these are good for supplementary practice or testing of knowledge, but it shouldn't replace the teacher.
I find it's very easy to forget about apps, like because people say you'll do them on the train, but I don't. When I'm on the train, I read news and I just leave them because they're just there in the background. If I've got a vocab list or a vocab book, which I was doing when I was preparing for the test, you've got a heavy thing in your pocket, which I don't know, the physical presence of it makes you look at it more. At least in my case.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So the next one is called I'm going to say VIP Kid. But it's an all cap, so it could be VIP KID. I'm not sure. This is a Chinese company, a Chinese website, and it's very simple. It's online one-to-one lessons.
Okay.
But it seems especially aimed at very young kids, kind of. I think from like 2 to 5 or that kind of age range.
Yeah.
And so they hire instructors from all over the world. Basically, it's not clear whether or not it's exclusive to native English language teachers or not. They have teachers obviously from the US and Canada and UK, but also Germany, East Asia, etc. They've developed their own homegrown video conferencing software, which allows a lot more, I think, interactivity between the instructor and the student. So that it's not Skype; it's their own thing. And it's in the news because they've just received like $100 million of investment. So it seems to be taking off a lot.
Okay.
And what may be interesting for our listeners is that their recruitment, they ask all instructors have to have bachelor's degrees.
Oh, okay. Well.
And they
say for conversation schools as well. Bachelor's degrees and nothing else.
Right, but bachelor's degrees, that's for conversation schools, that's just so they can get the visa.
Right, I suppose.
Are all of these apps free for the user?
This one is not.
Okay.
Yeah, this one is not.
The others are?
The others are, yeah.
Okay.
There are free versions of them.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. So, this is more like, proper language teaching, just through the internet, basically, or distance learning.
How's this different from any other kind of online class? Because there's a lot of different schools that offer this.
Yeah. So this one, the teaching materials are provided. The syllabus is provided. So the teachers have to follow the materials. And I think it's basically a combination of a PowerPoint, and they can also see the teacher. You get paid between $14 and $22 per hour, depending on bonuses.
Okay. Yeah. What's that in pounds? In yen? What's it in yen? Pounds in yen?
I'd say up maximum 2,000 yen per hour.
That's
not
not that good.
Okay.
But I mean, it depends where you're coming from. For us, that's not that good because of what local wages are. But if you're from the Philippines or something, then that would be quite good.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and the other advantage is you can, you do it from home. Obviously, you can set your own hours to a certain extent.
Yeah. But the other thing is, it's quite, as I said, it's kind of easy to ignore the technology in a way, like because if someone Skypes you and you even if you've set up the meeting, I'm always quite tempted to just not take the call and say, oh no, I was really busy, doing something. And like if you're a kid, unless the parents are sitting there watching you do it, then I don't know. It's difficult to enforce. My mum used to drop me. I had swimming lessons. She used to drop me off at the swimming pool every morning. I was too scared to go in, so I just stayed outside, and then she'd come and pick me up every week for like 10 weeks.
Okay. All right. The final one I want to talk about is an app or a bit of software called Fleex. You ever heard of Fleex?
No.
Fleex.
Is it connected to Fleek that you taught us?
Nope.
A couple of years ago.
Nope.
No. Okay.
So it's in the news recently because they just added Netflix to their Netflix, yeah, to their available video. So basically, it's a language learning software, but you do it by watching videos.
Okay.
And I think originally it was mainly like TED videos or those kind of things. And the way it works is it's with subtitles. So if you were learning English. If you're a Japanese person learning English, you would watch the video and you'd have both the English and the Japanese subtitles at the same time. And then it's a stage thing. So it goes from there, and then the next stage is the software it knows which bits of subtitle language are a bit easier. So it might remove the English, or it might remove the Japanese for easier bits.
Right.
And then eventually it removes the Japanese completely.
Okay.
And you're left with just the English.
So my question for this would be, how close are the subtitles to what's actually being said? Because quite often the subtitles are simplified.
Right, that's a good point.
Does it cover it?
I'm not sure. Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure. They recently adapted it for Netflix, so you can watch anything you want on Netflix with it. I imagine probably, to answer your question, I imagine probably not. They probably don't match, because I can't imagine that they've gone through and made their own subtitles for every single episode.
Yeah.
So they're probably just using existing subtitles, which don't perfectly match.
Right.
Well, the subtitles are pretty good, aren't they?
They're pretty close, but not always.
Yeah,
not
if you've got like a Quentin Tarantino film, for example, and you've got the English and then you've got subtitles for that, it's not going to get everything across. It's not going to get across the nuances, and also things like, I guess a different point, but like pop culture references and stuff are not going to.
No,
but
but yeah.
But you know what I mean. I think that the subtitles aren't going to really match.
Have you ever used subtitles to learn a language?
We always watch Japanese films and stuff with the subtitles on.
English subtitles or Japanese subtitles?
Japanese subtitles.
Yeah.
And I try and follow along.
Yeah.
I used to watch a lot of movies in Japanese with subtitles, and now I watch it without the subtitles to try and understand it better, basically. But I had that problem that when I could read the Japanese subtitles well enough, I felt that they were closed caption, so they weren't for me. They were for people who were deaf, basically. And I've realised that they were condensing a lot of what was being said. So even though it was in Japanese, it wasn't the same. They were condensing it down. So I felt that it was getting confusing for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. What I found is, if I was reading the subtitles, I wasn't really listening. I think the idea here is that you hear it and you read it at the same time.
Right.
But I don't think you actually do that. I think you do one or the other.
It's like multitasking. Again, it's like Denise Murray was saying last time, you're doing one or the other, you're not doing both. And by trying to do both, you're doing neither very well.
Yeah.
So this app takes away subtitles. It removes words.
Stage removal.
Yeah, stage removal. So the idea is you would first get your L1 subtitles and L2, and then it'll occasionally remove the L1, then it'll completely remove the L1. The other thing, which maybe is kind of nice, is you can pause and then click on words within the subtitles and get definitions.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because there's a lot of stuff to do with newspapers. There's a lot of kind of lessons adapted from real newspapers and things. So it's good to see that they're now doing that with like online kind of stuff as well.
Yeah. So now they advertise it as, you can watch Stranger Things and learn English at the same time.
Cool.
Oh, I'm up for that.
That's good.
Okay, anyway, that was this episode's TEFL News, covering some recent software.
TEFL Pioneers. So
today's TEFL Pioneer is Braj Kachru, who sadly passed away at the end of July this year. And I should say, we do these little 10-minute Pioneer sections. I think this is quite overwhelming to squeeze all of his life and work into this 10 minutes. But I'll try to do my best.
Okay.
So I'll divide it into two parts as we normally do. I'll talk about his life and his work. Okay. So Professor Braj Bihari Kachru was born on the 15th of May 1932 in Kashmir, India. His father was an educator himself, going by the name of Lala Sahab. And his father was always engaged in scholarly pursuits, and he sort of mixed with discussion circles, including like poets and philosophers in the local area. And he left a lot of his housekeeping to Braj's brothers.
Okay.
So he kind of like did more scholarly stuff. And
is this the father you're talking about?
The father, yeah.
Okay, right.
Braj, however, was raised by his father. Just Braj. Braj's house was often a venue for meetings and discussions. This afforded Braj lots of freedom to interact with these scholars at a very early age. Braj was also forbidden to go to school due to health reasons.
Okay.
And at the age of 5, he was misdiagnosed with a heart disease.
Okay.
So he was kind of forbidden from going to school very early on.
Mm.
So therefore he was schooled at home with a host of different tutors, and that perhaps worked in his favour. Because very early on, Braj won awards for his drawing and painting skills,
Okay.
as well as having numerous poems and essays published, all by the age of 11.
Mm.
And by the age of 11, he already had his own letterhead,
Okay.
apparently. So that's pretty cool.
He drew very good circles.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. And that will come back later, I think. Braj completed both his BA and MA in English, and this was around the time that India gained independence. So I think there was perhaps there was a renewed interest in English, perhaps even though they gained independence. I think there was a need for English at that time still.
Well, it was the language that I'll talk about this a bit later on. But there was there were different languages in India, but the tribes and the groups that spoke them didn't necessarily get along, and there were power issues. And English was seen as, even though no one liked it, it was kind of the most neutral. I think that's my understanding of it. Right,
yeah. So it was of great importance around that time. But because there was no local university in Kashmir, he had to leave his family, and he went to study in a different part of India. I believe he went to Delhi first to continue his studies. And as a student, he studied areas such as American structural linguistics and phonetics, and was later awarded a British Council fellowship to study for a diploma in applied linguistics at Edinburgh University, where he worked with Halliday, M.A.K. Halliday, and J.R. Firth, who I think I might make a pioneer in a later episode, because he seems quite interesting. I've never heard of him before, but he seems quite interesting.
Right.
And he, in Edinburgh, he stayed on to do his PhD, focusing on Indian English. And Firth was a big influence on Braj's academic pursuits. And according to a couple of essays that I read, Firth was one of the first scholars to realise the inevitable nativisation process of English in India. So he was the one, and that was a big influence on Kachru's early work, obviously. Very quickly after this, he returned back to India, and he started teaching, or he helped to set up a linguistics program to MA students. There again. And then he got offered a position at the University of Illinois, where he worked, I believe, until his death earlier this summer. So he was there since 1962, the early 60s. Yeah. So that's kind of his life going into what we know him today. And I'll talk about his work now. So you familiar with his work?
Yes. Very, very familiar.
Good. So Kachru is perhaps best known for realising the position of English as not just a language spoken in the UK and America, but kind of a diffused language spoken to varying degrees the world over. And it was him that coined the term world Englishes.
Right.
And in the 1980s, Kachru visualised world Englishes with 3 concentric circles. The inner circle, which contains first language varieties of English commonly spoken in the UK, America, Australia. The outer circle, where English operates as a second language, places like, for example, India, Nigeria, anymore.
Singapore.
Yeah. And the expanding circle, where English functions as a foreign language, places such as Saudi Arabia and China and Japan, where we are as well, would be in the expanding circle. And I don't think these circles have changed too much over time.
There has been, I think, increasing kind of criticism of them as being kind of a little bit too rigid. Especially now that there's more kind of movement of people and there's more mixing and diaspora stuff. So I think there is increased challenge, I think.
So I think one of the criticisms, although these are still very influential model, is that it's kind of geographically based, perhaps, and it doesn't take into account immigration and things like that.
Right.
And it's quite rigid. But with these 3 concentric circle models, Kachru attempted to reveal cultural pluralism of the English language and the variety of speech fellowships that exist around the world. And Kachru argued that for the developing world, English was, and still is, a tool for ideological and social change, and that perhaps at the time, such diversity was being underrepresented in mainstream applied linguistics research.
So I think that's true. Although I'd maybe question the role necessarily of English in that. I don't know. It seems like, I don't know, a little bit of almost like a bit of cultural hegemony to have just English as the driver of that.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think it was the driver, but I think he definitely saw it as a tool.
Right, and I think it can be, but my concern with that kind of idea is that it undercuts the role of local languages.
Okay.
And things like that. But just I don't know.
I'm sure it does.
But I mean, if it is just considered a tool,
right?
I know what you mean though.
Yeah.
But Kachru kind of said this in his writing. He said he thinks that his models, his circles, aren't exclusive to English. They could be exclusive to other varieties of, even within countries as well. Even within communities, these kind of circles can exist to a certain extent. So.
I think the problem with any of these ideas is not so much what the original conception was, but it's how they've then been taken and widely applied by other people.
Right.
Because like with any major idea, you'll find out the person who came up with it didn't quite envisage it in the way that it's been applied.
I think one of the roles of these concentric circles was that he wanted to kind of illustrate the pluralism of English around the world, and he kind of said at the time that this wasn't being represented in like corpora being developed in the University of Birmingham at the time, which was based on like British and American variants of English only, and that was kind of a lot of the research was done on that alone, and he was kind of saying, well, I guess what he was saying is, well, there's more out there to be looked at. Arguably. There's other models too, of course, not just Kachru's models, but there's MacArthur's Circle of World English and Modiano's, I always struggle with this word, centripedal, is that right? Yeah. Circles of International English. However, I think Kachru's model appears to be the most kind of withstanding and most well known of all the circles out there.
Dante's
Kachru also tackled language policymakers. Mainly for the same reasons, was that they weren't being perhaps inclusive of these other varieties out there, and attitudinal positions to English diversity head on. In particular, he challenged British linguist and current member of the House of Lords, I didn't know that, Randolph Quirk, who spoke of linguistic tolerance, believing that non-native Englishes are inadequately learned versions of correct native English forms.
Yes.
And that non-native Englishes are inadequately... Oh, I just said that, sorry. That non-native Englishes are not valid as teaching models.
Yeah, well, they had an exchange, which I think it's reproduced in Barbara Seidelhofer's book, Controversies in Applied Linguistics.
Right, yeah. He referred to it as the Quirk concern. He called it the Quirk concern. And Kachru criticised Quirk for taking a deficit linguistics position, calling these kind of expanding circle variants kind of deficient English.
But Quirk did experiments, but like he had one thing I think where it was French speakers, and he had very highly fluent French speakers, and found that they were. He concluded that teachers of foreign languages, if they're not native speakers, so called, they have to be in constant contact with the language and culture and with speakers of the language and culture, something like that. So very, as Kachru said, very much a deficit view. Yeah.
In later writing, Kachru would also go on to address what he called 7 attitudinal sins, which come about through a formal and functional, unjustifiable position of TEFL scholars, or TEFL scholars, as he says. I won't go into these, but these sins include the sin of ignoring linguistic interference and language dynamics, the sin of exhibiting language colonialism, and the sin of not recognising the non-native varieties of English as culture-bound codes of communication.
Yeah.
Again, I won't go into that, but he tackled all of these attitudes head-on in his work.
The one about interference, is that referring to kind of acknowledging L1 interference when learning a second language?
He was kind of looking at the TEFL scholar, and I'm not sure if he's talking about particular scholars or one person in particular, or just a general attitude. In terms of language, he often said that language teaching was mixed up with applied linguistics, and the two aren't the same, but they are often confused with one another, and that language teaching often missed out all these kind of, these other dynamics. kind of thing.
I'd agree with that. I've had some very frustrating conversations with people who've said applied linguistics is just TESOL. And when I say, well, it's not, and here are some other things, they say, yeah, but it's the main bit. Or they say, but all of that is just giving us information for how to better teach language. Which I think is incorrect.
Yeah.
But again, the history of applied linguistics book that we reviewed, even in that the author said applied linguistics is just SLA. So everyone's got a different view of what it is.
Right.
But I think we'd agree that Kachru addressed the sacred cows of English language by not just illustrating English language diffusion around the world, but he was also pivotal in challenging assumptions that I don't think we have those assumptions to that extent anymore, perhaps. But certainly when I first became an English teacher, I didn't really know about Kachru's work, and it was only when I started doing further reading, doing an MA, that Kachru's work sort of struck a chord with me. And so I remember seeing these circles for the first time and thinking, this is just my position as an English teacher from the UK in Japan, and kind of seeing the bigger picture of the world, basically. Which I don't think a lot of people see. No. Still.
Yeah. I mean, I think the circles just in themselves don't really say much of interest, to be honest. It's a fairly obvious thing that, there's what the three different categories are.
Right.
But it's what the implications of those are.
Okay. I don't know. I'd be careful saying that it's obvious, because, I mean, a lot of things, with hindsight now that someone said it, seem obvious.
Okay.
Like, the natural selection seems obvious when you think about it, but no one came up with it until... But groups die and whatever. Yeah. But it does seem quite obvious. But because someone's expressed it, now it seems obvious.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I teach a course on World Englishes now, and my students are not aware of this kind of thing. And they're Japanese students who are in there...
Of what kind of things?
Of World Englishes.
Okay.
So, they know what they are, but they have a very deficit view of them.
Right.
And even at the end of the course, when we've studied different World Englishes and we've looked at the histories of them, we've looked at the morphology and the language, and I've stressed every step of the way that these are equal Englishes. They still talk about mistakes instead of differences. They still it's very firmly entrenched, I think, in the mindset of a lot of people.
Right. Which is understandable, because English is a relatively unique language in the way that it's used around the world.
Right. But I think it's also, for a lot of these students in Japan, I think that they've been presented with an idea of British and American English as the ideal Englishes.
Yeah.
So I think more like, as you said, his work's very well known, but I think more dissemination of his ideas in a more popular way, and maybe at initial stages of learning, would also be very useful.
Yeah, of course.
I think that's... Maybe he's not responsible for this, but he's responsible for getting this started. But it's still the battle is still going on, trying to teach language variety in classrooms. That I don't think there's many textbooks that can do that.
Yeah. There are a few, but again, it does seem to be more. A lot of students will say they don't want it, I think.
Yeah.
We've talked about this before on the podcast.
Yeah. But also, I think even without explicit reference to World Englishes and those kind of things, I think maybe his work has influenced just a general attitude towards language teaching,
right? In
terms of less of an emphasis on accuracy and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's plenty of his books out there. One that comes to mind is The Other Tongue. I think it's called, from 1992, I believe.
Got it on my bookshelf.
And that's one book of his I'd recommend. So that's today's TEFL pioneer, Braj Kachru.
Okay, thanks for listening.
And don't forget, if you'd like to download more episodes, you can do that on our website, TEFLology-podcast.com. Please follow us on Twitter, @TEFLology.
You can also email us at TEFLology@gmail.com if you have any comments or any suggestions for topics that you'd like to hear our opinions on, and why wouldn't you? And you can also, what's the other thing we have? Oh, you can also like our Facebook page.
And don't forget to subscribe. That really helps our podcast and helps us to be reached by more listeners. No, that doesn't make sense. that helps us to reach more listeners.
We are experts at language, by the way.
That's what I mean.
So it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye for me.
Goodbye.